And we are live. Don Bentley, how are you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you?
It's fantastic. It's been a few weeks, but I really wanted to bring you back to talk to you, give the folks a chance to ask you questions, and
Sure.
also to go a little bit further. We talked about your time in the military, but
Yeah,
right after the military, you were in the FBI.
I was. It was a very fun thing to do. I got out of the military, and my first job out of the military was working kind of for a corporate company, which was a good transition, but it wasn't quite something I was ready to do yet. I remember coming in and seeing a cubicle farm as far as the eye could see. And I was sitting in this cubicle, and like 3 rows over was a guy whose daughter I'd graduated from high school with. And I thought, man, in 20 years, maybe I could move from this cubicle over to that cubicle. And
This
they
is in
were,
Austin.
no, it was in Cincinnati at the time. So
Oh,
I,
okay.
I got back. My wife and I are originally both from Ohio. We were high school sweethearts. So when we got out of the Army, we went back there. And even though we'd been in Texas a couple times, and our oldest two were actually both born in Texas, at
Mm.
different tours at Fort Hood. And so the I remember coming home and telling my wife, and it's like I really didn't understand all the jokes to that movie Office Space until now, and now this is my life. So I was fortunate that the FBI at the time had a program called the Tactical Recruiting Program, where they were looking for folks specifically who were coming out of the military with combat experience, both for their pipeline for HRT, and so what
Mhm.
they look for is people that come from a very specific background to bring them in with the intention of them then assessing in a couple of years for the hostage rescue team. And I certainly don't have that background as an operator, but they also had or still do have an aviation wing
Okay, so they
that
do
are
have
also,
pilots who are
mhm,
agents.
yep,
Okay.
yep, that are pilots that are agents as well that go through an assessment, not certainly not as rigorous as what the operators go through, but also an
Mhm.
assessment. Kind of, I guess maybe I would liken it a little bit to what in Army Special Operations you have, the Rangers and the Green Berets and stuff, and then you have the 160th, which is the Army Aviation Special Operations pilots. And
Mhm.
so at the time, I was 3 years into working in corporate America and knew I wasn't quite ready to do that, and so went into the FBI and was fortunate enough to get assigned to the Dallas field office. So there's
Hmm.
52 field offices, and then a number of what they call RAs, or resident agencies, that are. So, for instance, the office here in Austin is actually an RA of the San Antonio office,
Okay.
which is the larger office for that region. And so I was in Dallas, and was really really lucky in that my first squad that I was assigned to was called the FIG, or the Field Intelligence Group. And so your job as an agent on that squad is to run and recruit sources. And so it's a pretty fascinating job, and like what we talked
So is
about
it like
before.
intelligence? I've had like Robert
Yeah.
Dreek on, and he recruited into counterintelligence and recruited people, or is that more like recruiting sources for drugs and things?
So it can run the whole gamut, and what you usually end up doing is kind of picking up a specialization where you work more. You can run and recruit sources to answer very general questions like national questions, or you can also do it for specific cases in case agents. And so maybe a case agent would come to you and say, "Hey, I'm looking for a source that can answer this for the case I'm working," or you'd work together to kind of figure out who who would make a good source for this case, and then you work up kind of a package to go pitch that person. And so I
While
did
I'm waiting
that.
on people to ask questions,
Yeah,
could I get an example of like maybe somebody you put
yeah,
together? You can use a fake name and all that, but just like we had this person and
sure. Yeah, I'm not. I won't. I'll give you a hypothetical, because I don't want to get into
even
to
better.
any actual, yeah, any actual experience. But if you a case agent is responsible for the overall case that's being investigated against. So, for instance, if the case agent is working a case against a particular gang, and they're doing drugs or something like that, it becomes, as the case goes on, the scope of that a lot of times can get very, very broad. In that, oftentimes there's a criminal nexus that then reaches out from drugs to weapons to maybe human trafficking to. And so that case agent, very oftentimes, he or she will start to recruit additional case agents to help them and say, hey, I need you, if we're going to go up on a wire, I need you to take care of the wire. I need you to do surveillance for it. And so that person very quickly, as the case gets bigger and bigger, becomes, for all intents and purposes, a manager, where there's, almost a project manager, where there's a whole, because they're also meeting with the U.S. attorney at the same time and giving updates on the case, so that because you're always keeping the attorneys apprised, because eventually you want to take that case to court if it's criminal and do indictments and stuff. And so
how about the locals? Do you also work with the local police on this?
Absolutely. So what you have in Dallas, we had them, and I think most FBI offices have them. You have what's called task force officers, where basically that local police department, so for instance, Dallas Police Department would have agents that would be kind of L&O, or officers, excuse me, that would be kind of L&Os, and they would work with the FBI. They would be, maybe on your squad. And so part of their benefit that they bring to you is that if you're going to go do a raid on a drug house or something like that, the local police, the ones that work on your squad, would go do that with you, and then they can actually coordinate local police to come with you, to go block off the streets, to do what you need to do. And so when it's done effectively, and in Dallas, there was an excellent working relationship between the Dallas police and the FBI office there. You kind of bring the synergies of both of those two organizations together. And so when you have one of those big sprawling cases like that, what you always want to have is, a source or maybe multiple sources within that. So if you're looking at a drug organization, you're wanting to figure out, who can I get within that drug organization to come work for me, basically, because then you have, because part of what you're doing as a good case agent is you're looking from the outside, right? And you're seeing how the investigation develops and what you think's happening. But it's almost like doing like kind of like an archaeologist, where you're digging and you don't know what's inside that's happening. And so what a source does is provide you with that. Here's how the organization actually works, or you thought that this person was important for this reason, but here's how this person actually plays into the organization. And maybe it takes you in a different way. Like I said, a good case, and you even look at white collar cases, like a lot of times a white collar case will take 3 or 4 years to go from the initial investigation to going to court, because as the case agent digs, he or she finds other criminal nexus, right? So maybe it started off with money laundering, and now there's some bribes, and maybe some of those bribes are connected to local politicians, and so as it grows, the way that you figure out how the organization's working, how the criminal activity is taking place, is that you're recruiting sources in that organization. And so many times, as an FBI agent, that's certainly something that everybody's taught to do. But many times, kind of going back to what I helped out with, or what we did, is that you have folks who the case agent who's working the case is incredibly busy. And so if he or she knows somebody, or, because you work together with other agents and said, hey, I can't do this, but here are some people that we're looking at as potential sources. Can you go develop them as a source and recruit them and run them? And so it's, again, the amount of work that a single case agent does for a big case like that is mind-boggling. And so, like I said, they very quickly come into more of a program management role. Almost is how do I coordinate all the different efforts that are going on in this case, and recruiting sources is part of that. And so I did that for part of my time there, and then was also fortunate enough, like I said, to FBI offices, field offices. Most of the large ones, or maybe every large one, have their own organic SWAT team. And so,
okay, I was wondering about that, because I was like, I thought that would be HRT or locals had SWATs. I did not
Yep.
know there was a internal FBI SWAT.
Yep, that's right. So, and the way that that works is in most, except for the biggest field offices like New York, I think their SWAT team is full time, and I think the WFO, the Washington field office, it's full time. Most of the time, it's an additional duty, and there are many different additional duties you can do as an agent. You can be on the evidence response team, you can be on the hazmat team, you can be a negotiator. So SWAT is one of the additional duties that you can volunteer to do, and you have to try out for it, and then there's a whole bunch of schooling that goes along with that. But
Are you
the way
required to, or is it purely voluntary?
no, it's all volunteer, and that there's a selection that goes along with it, and so not everybody that volunteers is selected as well. And so you and so the way that it works, so HRT is the preeminent national hostage rescue team, obviously is their acronym, but kind of the preeminent national hostage rescue entity. And so individual field offices, like at Dallas, if we were going back to that fictional drug case, when you're going to do the final arrest, right? So the case agent, he or she has worked this case for maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and you have enough evidence, you have what you need for all the people, you have an understanding of who all the players are, the attorney's on board, everything is good. There comes that magic day when you're going to serve arrest warrants and take everybody down, and you bring in law enforcement from all over the place. So there are other federal agencies that might participate in it. There are local folks, and so they section off kind of those arrests into, if you're going to arrest, a low-level drug dealer or somebody who's considered nonviolent, then you might assign those to just another agent who's volunteered to come help in that squad. The folks who are more higher risk warrants, that's why you have a SWAT team, is to go serve those warrants. And so you will oftentimes, like I said, divide those up between folks that you have that your SWAT team is going to do. If it's a big enough, maybe other regional SWAT teams come in, or the Dallas Police Department. And then if it's a really big operation that has multiple nexuses or multiple different sites that you're trying to hit at the same time, a lot of times HRT will come into that because they have assets that the local office won't, both from an expertise perspective as well as being able to help with command and control and things like that. And so the in addition to being a national kind of response team, HRT, they will also come and help out for local operations as well. You say you're going to do, like I said, kind of a big takedown that has 5 or 6 different sites that are high risk thing, then HRT will come out and help out with that. So, yeah.
Do you bring in other?
It was really fun.
Do you bring in other agencies? Like, for example, you're doing a big bust. I imagine if you've mentioned 5 locations or whatever, and they were very hot. Would you bring in, like, let's say, people from other duty stations in the area to help, coordinate taking down everybody simultaneously?
It can be. Like I said, the really big ones might have, because a lot of times, and this is where you start to see the power, or not the power, but the synergy that a whole bunch of different federal entities bring to it, right? So ICE might be one of the folks that, or Customs and Border Patrol, or if it's a lot of times, if it's a really big one, then maybe a different office might send their SWAT team to come help serve high risk warrants as well, right? So maybe San Antonio comes up to Dallas or vice versa or something. So it's one of the interesting things about being an FBI agent is that you could be working the most, and mundane's the wrong word, but the most, a white collar financial violation. And you could be doing that Monday through Wednesday or Monday through Friday as your primary job. But if the violent or the reactive squad is going to do this huge takedown, you might then get asked to come go serve a warrant with it as part of that. And so there's certainly jobs or squads within, is what they're called, within an office, that have some that are more in the street that do more criminal stuff, some that are, and I'll come back to the specialties that focus on more white collar stuff, but every agent can be asked to come do and help serve a warrant and do an arrest. So it's kind of unique.
I've also heard, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the white collar stuff gets incredibly complex and tricky. Like, essentially, as warned, if you ever get subpoenaed on a federal case, pray it's not white collar, because you're going to be locked for a long time.
I don't know about that. But
Or
what
jury,
I will say,
I should say jury duty, not subpoenaed.
oh,
But if you're ever on jury duty, because they drag out and they're so detail oriented, and you've got to watch, both sides and try to get through this morass of details.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, so besides FBI agents, there are also FBI analysts, and those analysts run the gamut from financial analysts, intelligence analysts. And so a lot of the hard work that's done putting together, what is the criminal nexus here? How do these, from a forensic banking perspective, if you're working a money laundering case, you need an accountant that's going to be able to digest all of these bank records and things that you subpoenaed to say, here's how the scheme actually works. And to your point, what is different from the FBI than a lot of other members of the intelligence community, specifically, the CIA or DIA, is that anything that the FBI gathers, you're gathering with the intention that someday it is going to go to court, or could potentially go to court. And so to your point, it has to be, if it's only at a level that you're a CPA with 20 years of financial crimes experience to understand it, there's no way a jury is ever going to. And so part of that, and that's a whole nother phase where, again, talking about that case officer or case agent, rather, that is a program manager, when he or she gets ready to go to court and go through the prep for that, that's an entire another phase of the operation, right? Because it's everything that's documented. There's everything like, how do we help the attorneys actually make this case so that the jurors understand, how does all this tie together? And so, I mean, it's a pretty fascinating process to watch unfold from that perspective.
Well, cool. Now to get some whiplash, we have the first question coming in. And I think you answered this in our interview, but I could be wrong. And it's question 1. Could you share the events that earned you the bronze medal?
In Afghanistan, I received a Bronze Star, and then an Air Medal with V device for valor. And I think so. The Bronze Star is actually common then, and kind of quite common now, honestly, where when folks deploy to combat or into a combat zone, a lot of times a Bronze Star is something that's just awarded as part of the reason why you deployed, or as you come home, you're kind of awarded a Bronze Star, depending on what your job was and stuff. And so what I'll say is, if you think back into, I don't know, World War II or maybe Vietnam or something like that, and you think somebody getting a Bronze Star for charging a bunker or doing something courageous, just a Bronze Star by itself is oftentimes not that anymore. And mine certainly wasn't. I don't want to imply otherwise. What I think they're probably referring to is the Air Medal with V device, and that was from my participation, like I said, in the Operation Red Wings, where I was the air mission commander for an Apache QRF, or Quick Reactionary Force, that was launched in response to the 4 SEALs Mike Murphy, Danny Dietz, Marcus Luttrell, and Matt Axelson, who had gone in on a reconnaissance mission and were compromised, and then kind of called back for help. And so what my role was is I was on like I said, the Quick Reactionary Force at Bagram Air Base at that time, and kind of we responded to the call for help, if you will, back from the SEALs, and I was escorting 2 Black Hawks full of Marines who were responding as well to that call for help, And then up ahead of us were two Chinooks full of SEALs who were responding as well. And so my job at the time was to escort the helicopters that were coming in and providing the ground quick reactionary force, and then transitioning into on call, what we call CCAs, or close combat attacks, so that basically when the guys are on the ground, they have gunship support that's overhead for them that they can call for fires for. And as we know or as I'm sure you know from Lone Survivor, that operation went tragically wrong in a number of different ways. One of them being that the MH-47 carrying the SEALs that was ahead of me was shot down, and I wasn't able to stop it. And so that's what happened on that day.
To jump back to the Bronze Star, I think that's interesting. I'm going to age myself, but I was in the Army in the 90s. And back then, a Bronze Star was kind of a big deal. Not many people got them at all.
Yeah.
Has the Bronze Star become the new ARCOM, or Army Commendation Medal, in a sense?
Yeah, it is certainly much more common now. And I can't, I don't want to generalize, and I've also been out of the Army for 13 years. But when I was there and deploying back, the award was much more common than obviously your time in the Army or since. It's the award of it has certainly gotten a lot more common, for sure.
I don't want to begrudge anybody who's going through hell over there that. So I guess give a medal. It's not good times. Well, on a more recent note here, this will be easy for you. Hi guys, Don, your writing skills are phenomenal. If you could give a 2-minute mini masterclass on writing for aspiring authors from your years of learning, what 2 or 3 nuggets of value would you give? So you've got 2 minutes.
Wow.
Time is ticking. I'm just kidding. 2
minutes. 2 minutes to give it all. No, that's a great question, Gavin. I appreciate you asking it. Writing is a very strange endeavor in that, and I've kind of used this illustration before, and I apologize if I used it when you and I talked before, but writing your first novel is almost like if you're a furniture maker and you're making a chest of drawers for somebody, and you spend a year of your life creating this chest of drawers, this amazing piece of furniture and art. And at the end of that year, you go to hand it to the person who you think is going to buy it. And what you get back from them instead is a form letter that says, "No, thanks, not for me." And so you have no idea if it was the wrong color, if there were too many drawers, if they just didn't want that kind of wood. And that's what a lot like writing is when you're starting out, because you're very much in a vacuum trying to write a novel and then sending that novel out to agents on submission and then potentially editors. And oftentimes the only feedback you get is a form letter that says, "No, not for me, no thanks." And so what I would say the key things for my writing career is the first thing that you need is a critique partner who is hopefully a little bit farther along in their writer's journey that you are, and that they can, as you're working on that chest of drawers, they can provide feedback to you, that they can, as you're doing that process. And so critique partners, you can find a lot of different places. Some Barnes and Nobles or writing stores have them. I found I met mine both in graduate school when I was getting my MFA in writing popular fiction, and also at Thriller Fest. And so that would be my second thing. So Thriller Fest is a big writers conference for thriller writers that runs in New York every year. And what you get by going to a conference specific to your genre is you get to mix and mingle with folks who are already successful in their craft, who are where you want to be. And oftentimes, the classes are great at those writers conferences, but where some of the most important stuff happens is at the cocktail party at the end of every day, right? Where
the hallway trek is what we call it.
The fall, exactly. We had talked about this before, the hallway conversations of the hallway traffic, where you can come up and for the price of a beer, ask people questions about how they got started. What were some, when my debut novel came out, my agent, Barbara Powell, pulled over, Nick Petrie, who writes the Drifter series, Boyd Morrison, who writes with Clive Cussler, Graham Brown, who writes with Clive Cussler, and Patrick Lee, who's a New York Times bestselling author. And, we sat at a table together for an hour and a half, and I bought some beers, and they told me all the things that had gone right with their debut novel and all the things that had gone wrong, and, what they wish they could do over. And it was basically a master's class in writing that I got for the price of a beer or two. And so, getting with whatever your genre is, if it's thrillers, if it's romance, if it's science fiction or fantasy, there are industry conferences that the editors who buy stuff come from, the agents who represent writers go to, and the writers who make their living in that genre go to. And you need to go to that, just like in your day job, if you'd go to a trade show, that if you're an engineer that talks about engineering things. And that was critically important. And then I'd say the last one, my editor, Tom Colgan, swears he told me this, and maybe it's true or not. I tend to attribute everything wise to Nick Petrie, because if you ever get to meet him, and again, he's got this great series, the first of which is The Drifter. He's just a really smart guy. But he said, one of those two of those smart guys said that when you come to genre fiction, you want to bring something same but different. So same that you belong there, but different in that your own voice is being heard there. And so Mark Graney is a phenomenal author and one of my favorite writers, but I can't write a Mark Graney book better than Mark can. And so it's stupid for me to try and copy what Mark does and bring that to the field. But if I want to write in the same genre as Mark, I need to have read enough in that genre to understand what the readers want. And so that's the other thing I'd tell you is what you need to figure out is, where is your book going to sit on the shelf? Like, who is it going to sit next to? And you need to have read widely enough and deeply enough in that genre that you understand what the same is and what the different is that you can bring to that genre. So that would be my much more than 2-minute speech, I think, on writing right there.
Have you ever read Derek Thompson's Hit Makers or heard of it?
No,
Essentially, he describes a hit as something that is both familiar and novel at the same time. And that's kind of what you're describing there. So you're saying, okay, well, this is a thriller genre, so it's got the beats. People are used to it, but it's got a slightly different approach. And he went through like every single genre of things that are out there, which is fascinating. I had a question to, we'll expand on your 2 minutes here. Critique partner. Would you recommend having a critique partner who is only slightly ahead of you because they can still remember where you are at the same time? Because sometimes that's a piece of advice I've seen, like with podcasters and other things, that get with somebody who's like a year or two ahead, so they still remember what it was like a year or two ago, versus getting with the bestseller, who's top of the, like Brad Thor. I'm not saying that Brad Thor can't relate to you, but he's so far out of your zip code at the moment. It's difficult.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think the other thing, there's both the writing aspect of it and then the career aspect of it. And somebody who's a year or two ahead of you can certainly relate to both of those, right? And so as you're, like I said, going back to my, debut novel year, hey, that was only, if one of my critique partners, it was only 2 or 3 years before he had a debut. And so there were kind of some pointers that he gave me and some ways to do that. And I think there's a difference too, when you have a critique. So people like, Brad Thor, or frankly, Brad Taylor or Mark Graney or Kyle Mills, or people who have made their living, they're at Thriller Fest, they have this block of instruction called like Master Class Fest or something. And those folks are in, Gail Lenz is another one. She teaches a lot. They are masters of their craft. And so I don't think at this point, Brad Thor is going to be anybody's critique partner, right? Like he will come in perhaps and teach, and he was one of the founders of Thriller Fest too, and say, here is a master's class in this aspect of writing a novel. And so I think it's I think it's both more realistic and more advantageous that, you know, as you're knocking around and going to classes and you're going to cocktail parties or you're sitting down with somebody, you're more likely to find somebody and meet somebody who is a year or two ahead of you, right? Because you guys are,
Sure.
you're still in the same boat. You're still trying to figure that out. And I think that's probably a much more realistic expectation. I think on the other side of things, though, there is Steve Barry every year at Thriller Fest would teach this amazing class that was, you know, half an hour or 45 minutes long. And he would teach the same class every year. And his wife, he would often say that he didn't want to teach it anymore. And his wife said, no, you need to keep teaching it because people keep needing to understand this. And it was literally like the breakdown of a novel. Here are all the beats. Here's what you have to do at each one. And so when you're starting out as maybe any profession, or certainly anyone in the arts, there's this tremendous, almost exponential learning curve that you have to go in the beginning to understand your medium. You know, what are the parts of a novel? How does a 3-act structure work? What does the reader expect to happen when? And that's a huge learning curve, and you can get a lot of benefit from some of those master's classes and stuff like that. Once you get past that to maybe the journeyman stage, now you're getting close. And maybe when you're getting rejection letters from agents, they're not one-line rejection letters anymore. Now they have some feedback to them, and they're saying, this isn't for me, but here's what I think, or here's some things. And so that means you're getting closer, and that can both be incredibly rewarding because you're making progress, and still incredibly more frustrating because you're almost there, but you still don't understand why not. Like, what is the thing I'm missing? And to me, that's where a critique partner can be incredibly valuable, or can help you break through that last, you know, going from the 5-yard line to actually into the end zone, right? Like, what is the last bit that I need to do or that I'm missing? And I don't want to pretend like it's a magic formula that do this plus this plus this equals sale, but I think it's refining your craft that extra step, right? Like, what is it that's not working? You need, you know, one of my friends told me once when I was getting ready to take without sanction, actually, on submission to or to send it to the person who's still who's my agent now, who wasn't at the time then. He said, you need to do another edit before you send this to her. And it was, you know, I felt like that was a slap in the face. I'm like, how could you say that? I've edited this 50,000 times. And I sulked for an appropriate period of time. And then I came back, and he had been gracious enough to point out some things. And he's like, look, you've overwritten here. You have too many, you know, you don't need this. And that's the difference between being, hey, you're a pretty good writer. You know, you might have, you do some things well, to somebody is going to pay money and buy your book from them. There's a huge gap between those two, right? And so it takes sometimes a critique partner, and I have critique partners and I have beta readers. Beta readers, both are very important, but a beta reader, I have some of the same. My wife is my first reader. I have a friend of mine I went to high school with, who she's read everything I've ever written. And these people are not writers. They're not going to give you craft stuff, but if they read widely and they read in your genre and they do that, they can tell you when, hey, I lost my friend that I graduated from high school with. When I send her my book, she sends me back a chapter by chapter, and it's just, what is she thinking at the end of this chapter? What is she thinking about? What is going slow? What does she wonder? And so you get to have this bird's eye view into a reader as they're going through their book. And she's like, I lost interest here. And you're like, but that was a great scene. You know, how could you lose? Right. And then you sulk for a period of time, and you're like, okay, I got to fix this, because if she's losing interest, so is the next person that reads it. Right. And that's beta readers. But the other part you need is somebody to help you with that craft, right? Like, how do you rearrange that scene so that she doesn't lose interest later on? And that's what I think a good critique partner helps you with, or helps you grow.
How do you, I keep thinking of podcasters, I guess, but Ira Glass brought this up. He's with This American Life, been on NPR forever, very high level person. And he talked about the excruciating years before he got good. And as he put it, he was cursed because he had good taste. And but that isn't a stage of what you go through, that you develop
Absolutely.
a taste and you write something. At what point do you have it to where you write something, you go, it's not working? I can't
Yeah.
come up with anything right now, but it's just not working. Is that a major point of your development?
I think it is, and one of the great things. So the MFA program I went to was from a university called Seton Hill, not Seton Hall. That is much bigger and brawnier university.
But just say it fast. Just say it fast
Yeah,
so it
it's
makes
Seton
sense.
Hill, Seton Hill.
Yeah.
But what was great about it is it was an unabashedly genre focused program, and so it said if you want to write commercial fiction, we are the MFA program for you. And not only that, but when you come and you're accepted, you tell them what genre you intend to write with, and they pair someone who is a writer, a published author in that genre, and that is your faculty mentor as you go through. And so one of the things I learned for that is that so the thriller writers are one cohort, the romance writers are one, the science fiction, is that in your cohort, you do a lot of reading in your genre that the faculty members pick for you. And so there's something to close reading where you read a book through for enjoyment. And then if you're reading through as a craftsman, you're looking and you're saying, man, that was like Daniel Silva, his newest book, The Order, came out today. And he's one of my favorite authors. And there's a scene in one of his books. Let me see if I can do this without giving away. I'll just say it's the most climactic scene I've ever read. And I remember like perspiring and my heart thudding in my chest as I read this scene. And as a reader, you read it and you're like, that's fantastic. And then as a writer, you need to go back and say, what did he do? Like from a craft perspective, what did he do that gave me a reaction I've never had before as a book? And that's what close reading is. And so part of what they're writers who are much better than I am and much more famous that foot stomp that you cannot be a good reader or writer if you're not a wide reader, and because you need to understand and see how other writers do things, not just how they do things, but so you get that sense of this is a stale scene because I've read enough other good scenes that do it, and I've tuned my mind because I've read so many stinking books that after a while it starts to become instinctual because it's the same thing as going out and shooting 3,000 free throws, right? Because you're basically doing muscle and mind memory. You're doing the same thing when you're doing close reading because you're exposing yourself over and over again to things that work and sometimes things that don't work, so that when you sit down to write, some of it maybe is there are some rules that go along with it. Like one of the things they like this that people say is every scene needs to have goal, motivation, and conflict. Right? Those are three things that need to do. Or I think it's Elmore Leonard. His famous one is when all else fails, bring in a man with a gun. Right? So there are tricks that you can do, and those are the rules, if you will. But what's more important is training yourself so that instinctually or instinctively, I got to do something here because this isn't working, or it's not exciting to me, so I know it's not going to be exciting to the reader. But why? Like, what is it? Is it because there's not enough at stake here? Is it because I don't understand what the protagonist wants enough and they're just drifting through this story? Is it because I haven't taken a deep enough dive into this character and they're just a placeholder right now? Or what is it? Is the dialogue too long? Is the pacing off because I'm spending too much time on description? Or conversely, have I gone from fight scene to fight scene to fight scene and now the reader's numb to it, so it doesn't hold any value? Like, those are things you learn by reading people who are really good writers and reading them first as a writer and enjoying it, but then going back as a craftsman and saying, how did they evoke that emotion? How did they just do what there's I Am Pilgrim. I finally read that by Terry Hayes, and I'd heard everybody rave about this book and rave about it. And man, when you read that book, there's the point at which the title comes from, I Am Pilgrim, and you're like, holy crap, that is the best scene I've ever read in my life. And it's a page long, where where he does that, and you're like, oh my gosh, like, how did he get me to the point where he does one line of dialogue and you're like, yeah, and you're ready to just, stand up and do something, right? And so that's the part I think that is both craft and art is how do you dissect what another writer has done so you understand it, but then be able to put it all back together so it doesn't seem like you're following a formulaic thing or it's just step by step. How do you put the art or the magic back into it once you've pulled it apart and understand how it works?
Well, folks, please ask questions. I'm going to keep hogging the time until you do. Do you read outside of your genre?
I do. I read some crime fiction. I'm a big Michael Conley fan. More of the his Harry Bosch stuff I know is great. I'm actually a bigger fan of his Lincoln Lawyer ones. Like I love
Mickey.
the legal thrillers and stuff. Yeah, he's great. I also read a lot of fantasy. Was a huge epic fantasy fan. I actually thought at one point when I was first starting out, the first book I ever tried to write that I didn't get all that far in was a fantasy book. And I think I don't mean to imply that you should only read in your genre. I think you should read
I'm not saying that at
widely
all.
and
Sure.
see how other folks do it too. And I do, but I think you also have to come back to, I think, to the place where you're trying to make a living and understand. One of the Tom Colgan, he raves about Mark Graney all the time for good reason. But if you look at what Mark has done, he started with his Gray Man series. Then he wrote with Tom Clancy. He wrote the first book after Tom Clancy died. He wrote some of the Jack Ryan stuff. He's now written the standalone Red Metal, which is kind of his version of Red Storm Rising. And then his latest book, that's 1 Minute Out, he actually wrote in first person. And what Tom Colgan will say about Mark Graney is that Mark is an incredibly hardworking and he's a gifted writer, but he pushes himself with every book. He tries something different. He expands his horizon as an artist. And I think that's what you have to do when you watch the men and women who are truly great at this. It's they don't write the same book, or they don't write the same book in the same way. They're constantly pushing themselves and they're constantly getting better at their craft and they're not phoning it in. And I think the way you do that, or you inspire yourself, at least for me, is reading I Am Pilgrim, and you're like, holy cow, this guy is so good. Or I've said before, a lot of times when I get to the editing phase of a book, I'll read the latest Daniel Silva book because he's so good, and you read what he does and it inspires you. It pushes you as a writer to try and be better. And so I think, like I said, you should read everything and you should love reading, but at the end of the day, I think you have to stay, or at least come back to the place where you're trying to make a living, just so that you can see how the other people are making a living are doing it there as well.
That's fascinating. You brought that up about, I've seen it before, and I kind of agree that the true greatest guitar solos, the greatest performances, all of these things, you could see that they're on the very verge of failure. It is like they're pushing themselves to such an extreme degree that they're only one note off from blowing the whole thing up.
Yep.
And that tension is almost what makes a masterpiece.
Yep.
I think taking those chances.
Absolutely. If you ever, and so Michael Palmer, obviously phenomenal writer, and his son, Daniel Palmer, oftentimes teaches at Thriller Fest as well. And I got to attend one of the classes he took. He taught, and he goes through kind of his dad's methodology for writing a novel, much like, Steve Barry taught one, his dad one. And then at the end of it, he said his dad had two little Post-it notes that he would keep on his monitor as he was writing. And one is, "This is hard." And the other one is, "Be brave," right? And it's that be brave that exactly what you're saying, like, be brave enough to take a chance, be brave enough. I'm sure, again, to kind of highlight Mark Graney, he didn't need to write his next novel in first person. He could have done exactly what he'd done before. And I'm sure he would have hit the New York Times bestseller list because he's a great writer. but he pushed himself as a writer. And the same with his standalone book, you know, with Red Metal, he pushed himself as a writer. Or you look what, you know, Kyle Mills moving from being a very successful writer in his own series to taking over from Vince Flynn for the Mitch Rabb. He pushed himself as a writer to do something new. Or, you know, Brad Taylor's is a friend of mine and another writer I admire very much. And when Brad started out, he was writing 2 books a year in his series, and then at least 1 or 2 novellas that tied into those. And he, you know, incredible amount of, in the beginning, pushing yourself as a writer to establish, you know, an audience, to very quickly learn your craft, to do that. And I think, you know, when you look at the folks who have done this well and have done it for a long time, they're constantly pushing themselves and they're constantly being brave. Now, what you and I don't get to see is, you know, going into the writing office when, you know, Brad Thor or Brad Taylor or whatever has to throw out a chapter or half a book because they took a chance on something and it didn't pan out, right? And that's part of the process of pushing yourself. We only get to see the finished product, but I think it has to be that as well, is that when you take big swings, you're going to miss sometimes, and you're going to have to pick up the pieces and be like, that didn't work, or this, you know, this entire subplot that's 30,000 words long, I got to get rid of because it's not working anymore. And, you know, that's part of it that comes with it. But I think the folks who are truly great at this craft, they take those risks over and over again. And then, you know, they push themselves and they succeed.
Well, you're right. I mean, you have to toil in obscurity to some degree, or at least in private. And that leads into the 10-year sensation, that, you know, overnight sensation that I'm always talking about.
Yeah.
And we talked about. Finally, some questions coming in. Here we go. I'm going to mutilate the name, and I apologize. Mujtaba Alam, I think it is. I believe Chase Hughes has also published a military/government thriller. To build on Iris Glass's quote, how do you deal with your tastes growing faster due to wide reading than your skills?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think there's a couple different answers to that. I think one way to interpret that question is, how do you deal with the fact that you're in the really hard part of writing a novel, which for me and probably for most writers is right in the middle of the second act, right? Where nothing's happening, where you realize that burning idea that you had for the first act just ran out of steam, and you've got nothing that's holding up your sagging middle. And about that time, some other idea comes to you in a dream, in a fortune cookie, and you're like, oh my God, if I stop writing this novel and pursue the shiny object, there greatness lies, right? And so some of that is resisting that urge to jump ship when the writing gets hard, because you have another new sparkly idea. And this
is my victory lap.
Yeah, exactly. And then a lot of times that petering out if you go do that. I think the second part is maybe what he was referring to is some of the perils of when you read really great writers, you realize there are some that you're never going to be that, right? Like you can be a phenomenal basketball player, but you're never going to be Michael Jordan, right? That there's some God-given talents that you have that you can work the best at, and you're never going to be that. And I think that's kind of healthy too, in a way, because I think there should be, you know, tastes that are so extravagant that you know you're never going to achieve that, but you want to anyway, and you're going to push yourself. Mm-hmm. And then it can also be kind of, I think, good too, where you read something, especially when you're first starting out, and it seems mystical to people who actually get published. Like, how do they do that? Eventually, if you keep working at it, you'll get to the point and you're like, okay, I kind of see what they did there, and I think I could do that, or I think I'm close to being that good, maybe, or I think. And so a lot of times, you know, I have writers that I know I'll never be able to achieve, you know, what Daniel Silva does. And that doesn't make me not want to read him anymore, but it makes me read him and still think, man, I wish I could do some of what he does, or maybe I need to, you know, one of the things. Yet.
A lot of these are
at
you're
least not
comparing
yet.
yourself to somebody 20 years in the future. So
But
it's not a fair comparison. It's like, hey, well, why am I not Tim Ferriss? Damn it.
yeah,
Well, Tim Ferriss is a legend, or Joe Rogan. Well, let
yeah,
me get a quick 30 years background. So,
yeah,
in fairness, you're not Daniel Steve Silva, but you're also
yeah.
not yourself 20 years from now.
No, and that's a good point. That's a good point too. But I don't know. I think it's part of it is having people that inspire you and make you want to
Sure.
be better, but at the same time realizing not giving up on where you are right now because you're like, I'll never be Daniel Silva, so I might as well not even write right there. And so I think maybe that's part of the balance you have to learn to walk.
Well, perfect's the enemy of done.
Yeah,
Or to
absolutely.
quote Steve Jobs, great artists ship. Okay, this one's, I guess, kind of a cheeky question comment, but I know where it's coming from. Are they going to change the name of your helicopter? I'm going to say probably not, but I don't know.
No, I think so. One of the cool things that the Army has done is every helicopter, with the exception of the Cobra, is a tribute to Native Americans. So every helicopter is named after a Native American tribe. So the Apache, obviously, you have the Black Hawk, the Chinook, the Lakota, the Iroquois, which was the official name of the Huey. So I think I do not think there's a danger of the Apache changing names.
Okay, so it's honoring them, not mocking
Yeah,
them.
absolutely.
They probably
Absolutely.
enjoy it themselves. That's awesome. Okay, I know you've heard this before, but you will again. How much of you is in Matt Drake?
So I had a lady was interviewing me once, and she said, "Are you Matt Drake?" And I said, "I'm absolutely not Matt Drake, but I've stood in the room with him before," and that is absolutely the case from the perspective of both what I had done in the Army and the FBI, and then in my life after the FBI, I got to work with a lot of folks from the special operations community, and so Matt Drake pulls for what he does or can do is he's a combination of a lot of the men I have gotten to know over the last decade or so, and I pulled pieces of that from Matt. From parts of him, though, you're certainly, I think every writer that writes a protagonist, there are parts of him or her that you put into your protagonist or end up becoming, and you kind of go back, what you were saying before about being brave enough to do something. So I wrote 2 books that didn't sell, that were written in third person. And then when I went to get my MFA, as that program, you write a thesis novel. And that's part of the thing they do is they say, hey, be brave. This is, the novel you're writing for school. So if you've always wanted to try something, this is the perfect environment to do it. And so in my real life, I'm not nearly as witty as Matt is, because it's much easier to write a joke and revise it 5 or 6 times than it is to try and do it in real life. But I thought, there is none of that part of me in either of my first 2 books. And then, so I thought, if I'm going to try it, why don't I try and write a witty first person voice that's a little more than me, more like me, and is frankly a lot like another writer I admire a whole lot, Nelson DeMille's John Corey series. And so why don't I try that? And so there certainly are some aspects of that come into Matt where, I've said something to my wife that I thought was pretty funny. I'm like, I got to put that in. She's like, no, that's not funny at all. And so, or vice versa, where there's something that Matt says that I'll try and use later. And so there are certainly pieces of him that are me, the pieces where he kicks indoors and go chases bad guys and jumps out of helicopters and stuff. And that is more pulled from folks that I've been fortunate enough to know. And in addition to especially if you write in this genre, in addition to like what I said before, kind of beta readers and critique partners, you also need to cultivate kind of a cadre of experts that you can go to for about stuff. So without Sanction, there's a Halo scene. And I'm not airborne qualified. I've never jumped out of a perfectly
You did
good
a hey
airplane.
ho instead of hey low. I wanted to know about that because I thought that hey low was the more common way to get in behind enemy lines. Why the hey ho?
So it's
and we better define them too.
Yeah. So the high altitude, high opening is the hey ho, and hey low is high altitude low opening. And so the point of a hey ho is to actually do an insertion where you're going to take some jumpers out the door, and they're in the airplane that they're flying is going to fly away, and that they can infiltrate to their target via air in a way that's much harder to detect, right? So instead of doing a ground insertion or risking having an airplane come in, they can do that. And so that's more doctrinally what a hey ho is. In a hey low, and so that you use the chute as an airplane, right? And so that you fly the
Right.
chute is the term they actually use. So in a halo, it's not that. In a halo, it's usually more focused on, I want to spend as little time in the air as possible because of the threat. And so you're going to do, or little time in the air under a chute as possible. And so you're going to do the higher insertion, but then you're going to open the chute very close to the ground. And so the object of that is not to fly the chute or to fly the person a certain distance from when the aircraft inserts.
Because you're skeet.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
Essentially.
Exactly. So I was, for that section, like I was saying, I was fortunate enough to have friends who have done that for a living. And so I could give it to them and say, hey, read this. And they would come back and say this, and this. And I'd say, all right, I'll change these 3 things, but I need this for the story. So I'll just apologize for it in the acknowledgement section. So that's part of it as well, is it has to be good. I don't know who said this, but it's the, never let the truth stand in the way of a good story. And that's, I think, what you have to aspire to as a novelist.
No, I think that's wise. Yeah, a couple other comments. Let me see. You never know what's coming down the pike. You may be better. So see, 20 years, you may be better. We don't know. And also, keep at it. Michael Jordan never thought he would be like Wilt Chamberlain either. So you're in good company here. Out of curiosity, because I'm a huge audiobook guy.
Yeah.
Do you read your pages out loud when you're writing them, or after you do?
I do. So that I don't remember when I learned that trick, but especially when you're writing a book, and folks do this different ways. Some people edit. They start every writing period by editing what they wrote before, the night before, to kind of get in the groove. Some folks write all the way through and then come back and edit. Some folks do a mixture of that. But the bottom line is that you have read this book so many stinking times by the time that you're ready to try and submit it, that oftentimes your brain will put pieces in the book that aren't there anymore, or because you've thought about it so much, or you've done. And so that's what's real important, again, to have beta readers, because you're seeing somebody with it with open eyes. And in fact, I used to have my wife read every time I submitted a chapter or finished a chapter, and I quit doing that because as things changed, she would see ghosts, right, that I had taken out, and she would still think it was there and it wasn't, or vice versa. So the same way, when you get to the granular level of your editing your words, paragraphs, sentences, and structures, what folks a lot smarter than me have figured out is that when you read in your head or you read silently, you'll often substitute a word that isn't there, or you'll make the change automatically because of the way that your mind works. Where if you read it out loud, you can hear where those gaps are. It also helps kind of from a cadence perspective, because you reading it out loud can tell you differently how, whether something's too long, whether it's too verbose, whatever. And then a step further, there's a great writer named Jonathan Mayberry who does he's a New York Times bestseller, and I saw an article that he had written recently where he's had the same, and I forget the voiceover actor's name, read every single one of his books. And he said, now I hear his voice when I write, and it actually affects how I write, dialogue or words. Because I think the guy's name is Ray, I believe. I think it's the same one who does Jack Carr's audiobooks. And he's like, I hear Ray in my head, and I hear how
Ray Porter?
Ray Porter. I think it's Ray Porter. That's his as well. And he's like, so I hear how he sees things or says things. And Jonathan Mayberry sees it much more as a partnership now, because he's got the same actor that is reading his books. But I think that's super important as a writer, and it's also become, I think, super important as a
Market.
as a market. Like there are Mark Graney, I know, has written I forget what it's called, but like the Just for Audible or something, where he's basically
Yeah, the
written a book.
exclusives.
Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah, exactly, an audio exclusive. And so it's fascinating to me because I'm not a big audio guy normally. I'll listen to podcasts or the news or something like that when I'm driving somewhere
We'll
because
train
I'm
you.
always
We will
it
train
will
you.
train you. But it's been like, for me personally, my best numbers and my most consistent numbers have been from the audiobooks, and it's been, that's what
Mhm.
continues to sell the most reliably. And so it's really interesting. It's like I said, it's kind of new to me because I'm not that big of an audio guy, but it's fascinating.
Well, we're getting so time crunched now that
Hmm.
I can tell you I'm doing this. I listen to your book, and I'm
Hmm.
almost at the point where I will not have an author that doesn't have an audiobook because I
Yep.
do read the books and I don't have time, so I
Yep.
can at least fit it in with a walk or doing other things or whatever. It's very, very
Yep.
difficult. And in today's world, time is such a crazy premium.
Yep.
It's
Yep.
difficult.
That makes sense.
Well,
That makes sense.
we're at an hour. I have one last question. This just came up while you were talking, but I'm
Sure.
curious because mentioned your beta readers. Have you ever done an A/B test
Hmm.
with your readers?
An A/B test, like a personality test, you mean?
No, an A/B test where you can't make up your mind on how you're going to solve something or do something,
Ah.
and you write it in two ways, and you send one off to some readers and one off to other readers, and see what kind of reaction you get.
No, I haven't ever done that. I have, what I try to do, like I said, I've had the same beta reader, some of them for 17 or 18 years, that read stuff
Mhm.
that I haven't done before. And so it used to be, if there was something I was struggling with, I'd say, hey, take a look at this, or I can't figure this out. And so now what I've learned to do is to just let them read and give me their gut feel without me doing anything to influence it. But then there are times that I'll go back and say, hey, what did you think about this at this
Mm.
particular plot point? And my friend will tell me, and I'll say, okay, well, I was thinking about actually this instead. What do you think about that? And so I've never written like an A, B, or two different endings, but I will certainly, if there's something that I think doesn't completely jive or doesn't, I'll let them read through it first, and then I'll go back and kind of deep dive in it. And there have been quite a few problems I've solved that way, and frankly, quite a few things that, because again, the same thing, when you spend, a year of your life with the same book, you get pretty blind to it by the time you're done. You can't, and that's why you see most authors, and I didn't, never experienced it until it was my turn, where I was fortunate enough to actually sell it, that, you've edited a gazillion times, it goes to your editor, he or she comes back with comments, you edit it again with first pass pages and something, like, you are sick of that freaking book by the time it
Oh yeah,
actually comes out. And
and
so
in
a
two
lot of
years you
times it's
forget half
really
of it.
hard. Yeah. Oh yeah. Somebody asked me something about book two, and I was like, I don't have any idea what book two is about. I had to sit and think for a minute. I'm like, Matt gets in trouble and bad stuff happens to him. That's what I got right now. But
It's
that's
almost
where I
like
think
trauma.
it is almost like trauma. And I think, having, like, again, beta readers that you can trust, that read that, there's been a lot of blind spots that they pointed out to me, and then certainly some things
Sure.
that I've worked out by wargaming with them after the fact.
All right, another vote. My aging eyes love audiobooks. Absolutely. Absolutely. A little pro tip for you audiobook readers out there. If you're like me and if you're just sitting there listening to a book, you'll fall asleep, play solitaire on the computer or do something else, anything to
There you
engage
go.
your eyes just a little bit, and then you can continue listening to a book and you won't fall asleep. So that's the pro tip to wrap it up. Don, this has been outstanding. I'd love to recommend your website, but that's in the works. So we can find you on
It's still in the
Twitter,
works.
right? At
Yep.
Bentley
Yep. At
Don.
Bentley Don B. Yep. And the
And
same at Facebook. Yep.
well, Don, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Eric. It was great.